On the night of the Christmas party, my husband arrived with his mistress clinging to his arm as if she had already taken my place. The laughter that followed cut through me like broken glass when he raised his glass and told the crowd I was nothing but a failure. For a moment, I felt the weight of every year of silence, every dinner, where my voice was ignored, every time my family and husband made me the shadow of their pride. But then, in her arrogance, his mistress lifted her glass high and called me the CEO. In that instant, the music faltered, the room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me. My name is Claire, and this was the night I stopped being their humiliation and became the truth they could no longer deny. The cold air bit at my skin as I stepped out of the car in front of the Belmont Grand Hotel. Boston in December had a way of cutting straight through you, but inside my crimson dress, I forced myself to hold my shoulders high, chin steady, as if the chill had no effect. The golden lights of the lobby glowed through the glass doors, reflecting on the snow-dusted pavement. I tightened my grip on the clutch in my hand, inhaled deeply, and pushed the door open. Warmth and the scent of evergreen and cinnamon wrapped around me immediately. The Morrison Industries Christmas party was nothing short of extravagant. Chandeliers glittered above the ballroom, garlands wound around marble columns, and a massive tree towered near the stage, dripping with ornaments that caught every flicker of light. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne and canapés, weaving between clusters of executives, spouses, and carefully chosen guests. I could feel eyes following me as I stepped further inside. Some of them whispered, others smiled politely, a few simply stared. For years I had been the wife who trailed behind Daniel, the man who seemed destined to inherit every ounce of success. Tonight, I wanted to stand on my own, to exist without shrinking. My heels tapped against the polished floor as I made my way toward the bar, the weight of expectation clinging to me like smoke. For a moment I allowed myself to exhale. I ordered a glass of champagne, the bubbles rising in delicate strings. I watched the room, the familiar faces of board members, investors, junior associates, even their children dressed in velvet and silk. This was not just a party, it was a stage. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The shift in the air was immediate, like the ripple before a storm. Daniel walked in tall and confident, his smile already spreading wide. But it was not the sight of him that froze me. It was the woman clinging to his arm. Ashley Carter. Younger by nearly a decade, hair perfectly styled her body wrapped in a silver dress that caught every flash of light. She laughed at something Daniel whispered and leaned into him with an intimacy that was impossible to mistake. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and for one piercing second, every eye in that room seemed to flick between me and them. My hand tightened around the stem of the glass. I kept my face still, though my chest clenched so hard I could hear the faint rush of my own heartbeat in my ears. Daniel saw me across the room. His grin widened, the kind that was meant to cut rather than charm. He guided Ashley directly into the crowd, weaving toward me with deliberate steps. I stood my ground, unwilling to move, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing me falter. When he was close enough, he raised his voice, letting it carry across the circle of guests who had instinctively drawn near. His words were laced with mockery. Look who showed up. The failure itself. Laughter broke out sharp and sudden, as if the room had been waiting for a cue. Some laughed because they found it amusing, others because they were too weak to resist the pull of his arrogance. I caught glimpses of smirks, raised eyebrows, people nudging one another. Ashley tilted her head back and laughed the loudest, her hand pressing against Daniel's chest, as if she owned him and the moment. I felt my nails bite into the glass, my knuckles white, but I refused to look away. I fixed my gaze on Daniel, my lips pressed in a line, my silence louder than any protest could have been. Inside, heat surged, a cocktail of humiliation and rage, but on the surface I remained ice. Someone near the dance floor lifted their phone. The tiny red light blinked. Another joined in recording, angling for the perfect shot of the drama unfolding. I saw it, knew it, but I did not flinch. Within minutes, screens lit up across the ballroom. People whispered as they swiped showing clips to one another. I knew even before the first notification buzzed through that this would not stay in this room. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. My humiliation was already viral. I turned slightly, scanning the sea of faces. Some enjoyed every second of the spectacle, drinking in my disgrace. But some eyes looked away, ashamed, guilty, pitying. That pity struck me harder than the laughter. It burned. Daniel leaned closer enough for me to hear him, though he still spoke loud enough for the circle around us. Some people never learn their place. No matter how much you give them, they will never be enough. Ashley giggled, her silver dress shimmering as she shifted to press against him. He winked at her, then looked back at me, waiting, daring me to react. I lifted my glass to my lips, let the champagne slide across my tongue, and swallowed. My hands were steady again. I set the glass down on the nearest tray and took a single step forward. The noise of the ballroom seemed to recede, the clatter and chatter fading into a dull roar in my ears. I met Daniel's eyes and held them, refusing to give him what he wanted, refusing to break. The laughter, the cameras, the viral whispers filling the ballroom, they would not define me. Not tonight, not ever again. The night was only beginning, and so was I. I walked deeper into the ballroom, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses weaving around me like a net I could not quite escape. Yet beneath the swell of music and conversation, old memories stirred sharp and uninvited. For as long as I could remember, dinners at my parents' house had been the stage where I learned my place. My father Robert presided at the head of the table, his fork tapping against the plate whenever he wanted attention. My mother Margaret filled the silence with questions about my brother Michael, the golden son. Michael's achievements, no matter how small, became feasts of conversation, while mine were footnotes that barely registered. I could see it so clearly now, the narrow dining room with its faded wallpaper, the chandelier that flickered whenever the heater kicked on. Michael would stride in late, his voice booming, his stories already shaped into victories. My parents leaned toward him, as though every word was gospel. When I spoke about my day, about school, or later about work, their eyes drifted away, their nods polite but empty. Once, when I won a small art prize in high school, I placed the certificate in the center of the table, waiting for their reaction. My father glanced at it briefly, asked if there was scholarship money tied to it, and when I said no, he folded his napkin and said that hobbies don't put food on the table. Michael laughed and changed the subject to his basketball tryouts. The conversation swept on without me, and I sat quietly, the certificate limp under my fingertips. That pattern never broke. When I brought home an internship offer from a Boston consulting firm, my father barely looked at the letter. He asked if the firm was well known, if the offer was guaranteed. My mother only wanted to know whether Daniel, then my boyfriend, was serious about proposing. She had met him once and already praised him as reliable, the word she never used for me. Daniel had slipped so easily into their rhythm, it frightened me. At dinners, he praised my mother's cooking, listened intently to my father's advice, and laughed at Michael's jokes. When Michael teased me, Daniel joined in with a smile, saying that sometimes I overanalyzed things, that hesitation looked like fear. The table laughed, and I felt myself shrink smaller and smaller, pressed flat beneath their approval of him. I thought marriage might change that dynamic, that perhaps, once I was a wife, I would finally be seen. But even on my wedding day, my mother's words pierced me. We stood in the church hallway, scented with lilies, her hands adjusting my veil. She looked me in the eye and told me that families are judged by outcomes, and Michael was their proof of success. She whispered that he was their true pride, not me. Her tone was calm, almost kind, as though she were offering advice. I carried those words into the ceremony like a stone in my chest. The reception blurred with toasts and photographs, but one image never left me. My father shaking Daniel's hand, telling him he was counting on him to keep us steady. It felt less like a blessing, and more like a transaction, as if I had been handed over. Daniel smiled and poured champagne for my mother, making a joke about my stubborn streak. Everyone laughed, including her. I smiled for the camera, because I had to, not because I felt joy. Over the years, that hierarchy only deepened. At holiday dinners, Michael arrived with stories of expansion at his business, and my father praised his ambition. When I shared a success from work, my mother asked whether Daniel had closed the deal. When I explained that I had led the team, she reminded me that teamwork matters most. Leftovers were packed into Daniel's hands with a reminder to take care of himself while I carried the empty pie tin to the sink. There was one night I will never forget. I had just earned a promotion to senior strategy lead at the firm, a milestone I thought might finally earn recognition. At dinner, Daniel spoke over me to explain my project to my father, describing it as though he were the architect. My father nodded approvingly and told Daniel he had a gift for leadership. Daniel said nothing about my role. Later in the car, I told him it was my project. He replied that we were a team and that outsiders didn't care about details. His voice was smooth, dismissive, a blade wrapped in velvet. Even on our anniversaries, the narrative was the same. My mother toasted Daniel for keeping me grounded. My father praised his steady hand. Michael smirked, raising his glass and saying at least one of us had learned how to win. The room laughed as it always did, and I smiled because silence was easier than fighting a tide that had always swept me aside. All those dinners came back to me in flashes, now layered over the glitter of the ballroom. The laughter I had heard tonight when Daniel mocked me was not new. It was the echo of every laugh that had followed me from childhood to marriage. And yet, as I stood among the wreaths and watched the tree glitter under the chandeliers, something shifted inside me. I remembered the girl at the sink, rinsing dishes, while the family celebrated Michael in the other room. I remembered the bride adjusting her veil while her mother told her to be agreeable, never right. I remembered every quiet night when I let silence be mistaken for weakness. But tonight was different. Tonight the humiliation was no longer private, no longer confined to a dining room or whispered in a church hallway. It was viral, public, undeniable. And strangely, that gave me strength. I leaned against the railing of the mezzanine, the cool marble grounding me. I imagined my father's critical gaze, my mother's dismissive smile, Daniel's smirk, Michael's self-satisfied laugh. I lined them up in my mind like portraits in a gallery. But then I turned the page mentally, placing those images in the past where they belonged. A server passed with a tray of water bottles and I took one. The condensation beaded against my palm, cold and real. I twisted the cap, drank, and let the clarity settle in my chest. Around me the music swelled, conversations rose and fell, and somewhere another burst of laughter rolled through the crowd. Perhaps another clip of me had already hit social media, spreading like wildfire. But instead of fear, I felt resolve. The truth was simple. I had been underestimated my entire life by my family, by my husband, by every person who mistook my silence for surrender. Tonight they had humiliated me in front of 500 guests and countless strangers online. And tonight, I realized that I had nothing left to lose. I placed the empty bottle on a nearby table, squared my shoulders, and stepped back toward the heart of the party. The chandeliers glittered, the music carried, and the air vibrated with energy. My heels struck the marble floor in steady rhythm, each step a refusal to be erased. The night was no longer theirs to define. It was mine. I moved through the ballroom with my head lifted, weaving past clusters of guests who lowered their voices as I passed. The music was steady, the band playing a familiar carol, but the rhythm of my pulse was sharper, louder. Every glance I caught carried either curiosity or pity, and I refused to let either define me. Near the stage I saw William Harris, the chairman of the board, standing with two executives. His presence was unmistakable, calm and commanding, his tailored suit crisp against the backdrop of twinkling lights. He had always been measured, a man who observed more than he spoke, and in the years I had known him, he never wasted words. Our eyes met, and for the first time that night, I felt a thread of steadiness tug inside me. When his conversation ended, he stepped away from the group and approached me. His expression was neutral, but not unkind, his gaze steady. He stopped a few feet from me, and in the low hum of the ballroom, his voice was low enough to feel private, yet firm enough to carry weight. "Claire, you do not need to prove yourself to Daniel. The board has already seen what you are capable of." The words landed like a stone in water, rippling through me. For a moment, I could only blink at him, the din of laughter and chatter around us blurring. He did not say it with sympathy. It was not pity. It was a statement simple and factual, carved from truth. I swallowed hard, feeling the sting of humiliation at the memory of Daniel's taunts, and the sharper ache of my parents' lifelong dismissal. Still, I found my voice. Do they really see me, William? Or do they see only his shadow? His expression did not shift, but his eyes narrowed slightly, considering. I think they see more than you realize. You have led projects under pressure, carried departments when others faltered. The numbers speak, and so does the loyalty of the teams you built. He leaned in just a fraction enough that only I could hear the last part. You have earned this. Daniel knows it. That is why he mocks you. The truth in his words cut deeper than any insult. My chest tightened, and I felt heat rise to my face. Daniel's cruelty was not about me being weak. It was about me being a threat. For years I had been told I was lesser, but here was the man at the top of the company telling me otherwise. I glanced around us, the swirling sea of sequins and tuxedos, the phone screen still glowing with the aftermath of Daniel's performance. If I speak, if I let the truth out, it will not just be him in the spotlight. It will drag me too. William's gaze never wavered. If that time comes, I will stand beside you. His words were deliberate, and the certainty in them steadied me, like a hand pressed against my back. The band struck a louder note, a trumpet lifting into the melody of another carol, and the crowd shifted toward the dance floor. I moved with William to the edge of the room, away from the noise and the quiet. There was sharper, filled with fragments of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Do you know what it costs to expose someone like him? I asked quietly, the weight of years pressing against my ribs. Everything, William said simply, but you already live with the cost of silence. I turned the words over in my mind, remembering the dinners where I disappeared, the wedding whispers, the years of letting others write my story. Silence had never spared me humiliation. It had only delayed it. Across the room I caught sight of Daniel again, his hand curled around Ashley's waist as he entertained a group of investors. She tilted her head back, laughing too loudly, her silver dress flashing under the lights. He looked so sure, so smug, as if the night belonged to him. My stomach twisted, but instead of dread, I felt the first sparks of resolve burn hotter. I lowered my voice. If the truth comes out, there is no turning back. William nodded once. Then do not turn back. For a moment I saw not just the chairman of Morrison Industries, but the man who had watched me in meetings, seen me gather fraying teams into something cohesive, watched me present when others stumbled. His support was not sentimental. It was rooted in evidence, in years of watching. That was what made it matter. The sound of laughter swelled again, pulling my attention back to the crowd. A new ripple of amusement spread from one cluster of guests to another, and I saw a woman holding her phone high, showing a clip to her companions. My humiliation was spreading in real time, igniting like dry leaves. I felt my hands clench, my nails pressing into my palms. But when I looked at William, his expression was steady, his presence an anchor. Let them laugh, he said quietly. Their laughter does not decide who leads this company. I drew a slow breath, the weight in my chest easing just slightly. For years I had wanted someone to tell me I was enough to fight against the tide of dismissal. Tonight I did not just want it. I believed it. As the evening stretched, I felt the currents of the party shift. Guests moved in waves toward the buffet, toward the dance floor, toward the corners where deals were whispered. I stood in the center, no longer shrinking, and William stayed near, not hovering, but close enough that I felt his words echo in the air between us. Daniel's voice carried over the crowd again, loud and jovial, spinning some story about a client. People laughed, but this time I listened differently. His bravado rang hollow, now brittle around the edges. He needed their laughter. I no longer did. I straightened my shoulders, letting the music and chatter wash over me. William's words repeated in my mind like a drumbeat. I had earned this. Daniel knew it. And if the truth needed to be spoken, I would not be speaking it alone. The night pressed on, glittering and sharp, and I stood ready, steadier than I had been in years, as the weight of choice settled into my bones. Daniel's voice cut through the chatter as he raised his glass, the gold of his champagne catching the light. He was standing near the center of the ballroom, his arm looped around Ashley's waist, his grin sharp and merciless. People quieted as they noticed him instinctively gathering closer, eager for the spectacle he always seemed to create. "Here's to another successful year for Morrison Industries," he announced, pausing for effect, as if he were the one hosting. "And of course, here's to the board, the true leaders of this company." He tilted his head toward the cluster of executives near the stage. "But not everyone gets a seat at that table." A ripple of amusement moved through the room, like a match catching dry kindling. His eyes slid to me, locking in deliberately. "Some people just aren't good enough to sit where real decisions are made." The words hung in the air, heavy, unmistakable. A sharp laugh broke from Ashley, her silver dress flashing as she leaned closer into him. She lifted her glass, adding her voice clear and mocking. "She can barely keep up with the small things, Daniel. Can you imagine her at the head table?" The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was loud. Some guests clutched their glasses tighter shoulders, shaking with amusement. Others smirked, nudging each other, waiting for me to crumble. And yet I also caught the discomfort in the eyes of a few, their smiles fading, their gazes darting toward me, then quickly away, as if they did not want to be caught watching cruelty unfold. I did not move. My hands rested calmly at my sides, though my pulse hammered against my ribs. I fixed my gaze on Daniel, letting my silence sharpen into something colder than words. My eyes did not falter. I let him see it, let him feel the steel I had carried through years of dismissal. Ashley giggled again, her voice rising above the music, clinging to him, as though his cruelty was a performance staged only for her. She whispered something in his ear, and he laughed louder, lifting his glass higher, as though the toast was complete. The clinking of crystal followed, brittle and thin, echoing too brightly against the chandeliers. For the first time that night, I felt anger slide into clarity. His taunts were not clever. They were predictable, rehearsed, the same patterns he had always used to remind me of my supposed place. But I was no longer shrinking. His words rang hollow against the steadiness I carried now. As I scanned the faces around me, I caught sight of someone at the edge of the crowd. Emily Davis. She was younger, no more than 27, and I remembered the way Daniel had cut her down in a meeting months ago, dismissing her ideas in front of her entire team. She had looked small, then her voice barely audible after his mockery. Tonight she stood rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes burning as they fixed on him. Her gaze shifted briefly to me, and in that split second, something passed between us. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. She knew what it felt like to stand in the crosshairs of his cruelty. She knew the sting. The laughter around Daniel swelled again, a wave of shallow amusement that seemed to rattle against the walls of the ballroom. I did not join it, and I did not retreat. I simply stood, my expression steady, my silence more cutting than any defense I could have offered. The music resumed softly in the background, the band shifting to another carol, but the edge in the air remained. Daniel lowered his glass with a smirk, satisfied, his arms still snug around Ashley. He believed the night was his, that his words had landed, that the room belonged to his performance. But I knew better. Because even as the sound of laughter faded into scattered conversations, I saw Emily's knuckles white where her fist curled tight. I saw the dart of shame in the eyes of a few executives who had once laughed freely at his jokes. And I felt my own resolve deepen, threading itself into bone. I turned slightly, moving away from the crowd, leaving Daniel to his hollow triumph. The sting of his mockery was still hot against my skin, but beneath it ran a current of something steadier, stronger. Every word he spoke tonight was proof of his fear, proof that he saw me not as invisible, but as dangerous. As I walked toward the far end of the ballroom, the lights catching on polished marble, I felt Emily's gaze follow me. She did not speak, but her silence said enough. She would not forget what she had seen, and neither would I. The night carried on, laughter and music rising again, but the sharpness of the moment lingered, a blade still hanging in the air. And for the first time, I knew I was not the only one who had felt its cut. The memory of his smirk still lingered when I thought back to the night I stayed late at the office long after the rest of the floor had gone quiet. Morrison Tower was a hollow shell at that hour, the hum of the air conditioning louder than the city below. I had been buried in quarterly reports when I noticed the folder on Daniel's desktop, carelessly left open, its subject lines glowing against the dark screen. At first I almost clicked away, tired and ready to leave, but something pulled me closer. The subject line read, "Contract Adjustments with Harrington Group." My chest tightened. Harrington was one of our fiercest competitors, and Daniel had no business communicating with them not under company servers. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse before curiosity sharpened into suspicion. I opened the email thread. Lines of text stared back at me, blunt and damning. Daniel was discussing upcoming contract details leaks about Morrison's bids figures that only senior executives had access to. He was feeding Harrington information, offering them leverage cloaked in polite business language that did nothing to hide the betrayal. My stomach turned cold. I scrolled further, each message worse than the last, ending with one that chilled me to the core. A confirmation that once Morrison lost the bid, Daniel would be compensated. He had traded loyalty for money, and the company's future was nothing but currency in his pocket. I sat frozen in my chair, the glow of the screen painting my face in stark white light. Years of humiliation and his smug superiority now sat exposed in black and white. He wasn't just cruel, he was corrupt. My fingers trembled as I reached for a spare external drive from my desk drawer. Sliding it into the port, I felt the weight of what I was about to do settle in. The office was silent except for the faint buzz of electronics as the files copied over. Each bar that filled on the progress window was like a heartbeat pounding out a rhythm of resolve. If I stopped now, I could pretend I had never seen it. But the image of Daniel standing in that ballroom raising his glass laughing as he called me weak flashed through my mind. My jaw tightened. No more silence. I whispered into the emptiness of the office, the words escaping before I even realized I had spoken them. This will be the proof that takes him down. I leaned back, watching the reflection of the screen glow in the glass partition beside me. My own face stared back, not broken or small, but sharpened with focus. The fear was still there, but it had taken on a new shape, blending with determination until they were indistinguishable. When the last file transferred, I ejected the drive and held it in my palm. It was small, light, almost laughably fragile, yet it carried the weight of truth heavy enough to crush him. I slipped it into my bag, zipping it closed as if sealing a secret. The elevator ride down was slow, the mirrored walls reflecting back a woman I barely recognized. My shoulders squared, my chin lifted. For once, I was not carrying Daniel's shame. I was carrying his downfall. Outside, Boston's winter air bit at my skin, the city lights gleaming sharp against the dark sky. I pulled my coat tighter, the hard drive pressing against my side like a hidden weapon. I walked with purpose through the icy streets, every step steadier than the last. I remembered the countless nights I had stayed up pouring energy into projects Daniel later claimed as his own. I remembered the board meetings where he smirked as if my words were interruptions, not contributions. And I remembered the laughter that followed me through the ballroom only hours before. Now I had something stronger than silence, stronger than endurance. I had proof. I reached my apartment and locked the door behind me. The city's noise was muffled by the thick walls, leaving only the sound of my breathing. I set the drive on the desk, its black casing catching the faint glow of the lamp. For a long time I just stared at it, letting the reality sink in. There was no turning back. This was not a weapon to be waved lightly. It could destroy Daniel, but it could also shatter the company if handled recklessly. And yet the image of him raising his glass replayed in my mind, the sound of Ashley's cruel laugh ringing in my ears. I reached for my notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. My pen scratched across it, notes, dates, patterns I had noticed in his behavior. Slowly, a timeline began to form, each point tethered to an email, a file, a contract clause I had seen. The evidence was not just numbers. It was a story, one that I was now ready to tell. As I set the pen down, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer reacting to Daniel's cruelty. I was preparing. The balance was shifting, and this time I was holding the weight. The lamp flickered as the heater kicked on, filling the room with a low hum. I leaned back in my chair, whispering the words again, firmer this time, as if to etch them into the walls around me. This will be the proof that takes him down. I stepped back into the ballroom as if nothing had shifted, but inside, I was no longer the same. The crowd still buzzed with laughter, the chandeliers glittering overhead, and the scent of champagne clung to the air. Daniel stood across the room with Ashley, his hand resting smugly on her back. My parents and Michael flanked him, their smiles broad, as if I had never existed except to serve as their convenient target. When my mother's eyes found me, they narrowed with the same dismissive glint I had known since childhood. She raised her glass, and her voice carried farther than she realized. "At least Michael makes us proud. Claire is lucky she was even invited." The words stung sharper than the champagne bubbles rising in my glass. My father chuckled, nodding, as if that statement was fact carved in stone. Michael laughed too, leaning in toward Daniel with the familiarity of old allies. It was a chorus of betrayal, rehearsed and seamless. I held my ground, the marble floor cold beneath my heels. I thought of chapter after chapter of my life, where their judgment had been the ink writing me into the role of failure. They were playing their part again, and for a fleeting moment, I almost fell into mine. But then I remembered the drive tucked away in my bag, the silent weight of truth humming at my side. Michael's voice rose above the music. He smirked at me, his arm slung carelessly over the back of his chair. "Some people are made for greatness. Others like you just get to watch." A ripple of laughter spread across their table. The sharp sound of cutlery against china punctuated it, and I could feel eyes from other tables flicking toward me, measuring my reaction. I steadied my breath and forced my lips into the faintest curve, not a smile, but something close enough to confuse them. My voice cut through their laughter, calm and cold. "Keep laughing. Tonight will not end the way you think." The table quieted for a moment, just long enough for my words to settle into their ears. My mother's glass froze halfway to her mouth. Daniel's grin faltered, if only slightly, before Ashley nudged him and whispered something in his ear. He laughed again, but I caught the flicker in his eyes. He had heard me. The band struck up another song, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. The noise swallowed up the tension, but I felt it lingering like a shadow no one could name. I turned from their table and made my way toward the back of the room, weaving through clusters of guests. My father's voice followed me, not loud enough for the crowd, but sharp enough for me. "You will never be more than an afterthought." I did not turn back. My pulse quickened, but it was no longer from shame. It was from clarity. They had drawn their lines in the sand, and I had chosen mine. I found myself near the massive ice sculpture at the center of the buffet, the light refracting through its sharp edges. Emily Davis stood a few feet away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had seen everything. Her young face carried the tight expression of someone who recognized cruelty and had lived beneath it herself. When her eyes met mine, she gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible. It was not pity. It was solidarity. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in years, I felt the faint hum of something I had long thought lost. Support. Still, my family's words echoed in my ears, louder than the music, louder than the chatter. Every sneer, every dismissal pressed against me like old bruises. I sipped my champagne slowly, the bubbles bitter on my tongue, and let them fuel me instead of break me. The ballroom shimmered on, oblivious to the battle lines drawn in its center. Waiters passed with silver trays, laughter rose and fell like waves, and Daniel leaned into the role of charming executive, as though he hadn't sold his soul for a payout. My family propped him up like he was their greatest achievement, their perfect replacement for the daughter they never wanted. I let them have their moment. They believed they were winning. They thought humiliation was the end of my story. But as I turned away from their table and looked at the glittering expanse of the room, I felt the weight of certainty settle into my bones. Their victory was only an illusion. The night pressed forward, its music swelling and fading. I could feel the pulse of change underneath it all, quiet but insistent, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And when it did, none of them would see it coming. Ashley's laugh cut through the music, high and careless, as she clinked her glass too hard against Daniel's. Her cheeks were flushed, and her voice carried farther than she meant it to. "CEO like you looks so small town." The words slipped into the air like shards of glass, sharp and undeniable. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Conversations faltered. Silverware paused mid-air, and even the band stumbled over a note. Silence pressed in heavy and expectant. Then laughter erupted, rolling across the ballroom like thunder. Guests assumed it was just another cruel joke at my expense, Ashley tossing out titles the way one might toss confetti. But I did not move. My heart pounded once hard, then steadied into an iron rhythm. Ashley's eyes darted around the room, realizing too late what she had said. Daniel's smile cracked like a mask in the heat of fire. He grabbed her arm and hissed his words meant for her alone, but audible to those nearest. "What the hell are you doing?" Her laugh stuttered into silence. She tried to backpedal, waving her glass as if it was all a misunderstanding. But the seed had been planted. I could hear it sprouting in the whispers that rose from the tables. "CEO. Did she say CEO? Since when?" Daniel forced a chuckle and raised his voice, his desperation threading through his practiced charm. "CEO. Are you kidding me? She cannot even keep her own house together, let alone run a company." The words were cruel, calculated to twist the memory of my divorce and the foreclosure that had followed. His smirk was brittle, though his eyes darting to see if anyone believed him. But the guests were no longer laughing quite as freely. The room had shifted. I lifted my chin, letting the silence stretch. The chandeliers glittered above us, casting their fractured light across faces, suddenly curious, suddenly uncertain. I met the eyes of one of the board members at a corner table. His brows were drawn, his lips pressed tight. He had heard. He understood. Ashley tugged at Daniel's sleeve, her smile faltering as the whispers grew louder. She tried to laugh again, but it came out thin, a sound more nervous than mocking. Daniel's jaw clenched, and I watched the sweat bead near his temple, despite the cool winter air seeping through the windows. My parents sat rigid at their table, their forced smiles brittle as glass. Michael looked between Daniel and me, his expression shifting from amusement to unease. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. I remained still, every muscle controlled my breath slow and steady. Inside a storm raged, but it was one I had harnessed. Ashley had given me more than she understood. One careless slip, one word too many, and the ground beneath Daniel's feet had begun to crumble. The music faltered again, as if the band felt the tension rippling through the crowd. Guests leaned closer to each other, voices hushed but insistent. Did the board already decide? Is she really in charge? Why has no one said anything? Daniel raised his glass higher, forcing a laugh that cracked at the edges. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us not indulge in silly rumors. Tonight is about celebration, not fantasy." But his words rang hollow. They clattered to the floor like dropped coins, valuable to no one. The guests did not quiet. They kept whispering, kept glancing at me, kept looking at each other as if searching for confirmation. I finally allowed myself a small smile, the kind that did not reach my eyes. It was enough. The shift had happened. The balance of power in that glittering room no longer belonged entirely to him. Ashley stared at her glass, as though the answer might be hiding in the bubbles. Her shoulders curled inward, her bravado gone. Daniel's hand stayed clenched at her elbow, too tight, too desperate as he tried to salvage what he could. But the whispers had already grown legs. They would not be stopped. I stepped forward, moving closer to the center of the room. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each sound sharp as a gavel. Heads turned. The laughter had faded into a low hum of speculation. For a moment, the night held its breath again. I could feel every eye on me, weighing the rumors against the woman standing before them. I did not need to speak yet. Their doubt was already alive, and it would only grow. Ashley's words still lingered in the air, and Daniel's denial only made them stronger. I let the silence stretch once more, savoring the shift, the unmistakable edge of control tipping toward me. The night was unraveling thread by thread, and for the first time, it was not my life that was being pulled apart. It was his. I walked toward the stage, as if I had been preparing for that moment, my entire life. The crowd shifted voices, low phones already raised recording every step. The band had fallen silent, and the only sound was the echo of my heels against the wooden floor. The chandeliers above seemed to burn brighter, as if the night itself was holding me in its light. I took the microphone from its stand and let the silence breathe for a moment longer. My chest rose and fell once steady, and then my voice cut through the air clear and sharp. It is true. I am the CEO. The room gasped like a single body. The ripple of shock traveled from the front tables to the back, where waiters carrying champagne froze mid-stride. Eyes widened, mouths parted, and the murmurs turned into a roar of disbelief. I lifted my hand, palm open, commanding silence. This decision was made by the board of directors. I continued my gaze, sweeping the room steady as steel. Tonight, you all deserve to know. Morrison Industries has entered a new era. The doors at the back opened, and William Harris stepped forward, his tall frame commanding as much authority as his presence always had. Behind him came the other board members, their expressions firm, resolute, unshaken by the chaos of the room. They took their place beside me, a line of power that stood shoulder to shoulder, and William's voice carried across the hall. What Claire said is true. The board unanimously appointed her chief executive officer of Morrison Industries. The weight of his words dropped like a stone into water. The murmurs surged again, not with laughter this time, but with awe. Guests pulled out their phones, recording, sending messages, the glow of screens lighting faces in the dimmed ballroom. I could see hashtags already forming in their heads, stories already being written before the night was even over. The spotlight snapped on, bathing me in white light. It felt warm on my skin, illuminating every line of determination on my face. I did not flinch. I stood taller, straighter, letting the light claim me. I saw Daniel then across the room, his complexion drained of color, as if all the blood had abandoned him. His glass hung uselessly in his hand, his knuckles white. Ashley clutched his arm, her lips parted in disbelief, her eyes darting between me and the board, as though searching for some sign it was a cruel joke. But it was not a joke. It was the truth. I let silence settle again, let the image burn into the minds of everyone watching. I wanted them to see me not as the woman mocked, not as the daughter overlooked, not as the wife dismissed. I wanted them to see me as I truly was, as the leader I had fought to become. The applause did not come immediately. It started small, hesitant, a few claps from the far side of the room. Then another, until it swelled into something undeniable. The sound filled the hall, rising, breaking over me like a wave. Some clapped with genuine conviction, others because they knew which way the wind was blowing, but it did not matter. The tide had turned. I locked eyes with my parents across the room. My father's lips pressed into a hard line, his jaw tight. My mother's hands gripped her clutch so fiercely I thought the beads might scatter across the floor. Michael's face was caught between shock and anger, but even he knew the truth could not be undone. Ashley leaned toward Daniel, whispering frantically. His face twisted, trying to salvage something, anything, but the power was no longer his. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He shut it again, his throat working as though swallowing his own downfall. William placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, a gesture not of ownership, but of recognition. "You earned this," he said quietly, though the microphone did not carry his words. "Let them see you." I nodded once. My eyes swept across the room again, steady and unyielding. Cameras flashed, the buzz of notifications filled the air, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me was mine, solid and unshakable. I did not need to humiliate Daniel further, not yet. His humiliation was already written on his face, carved into the pale lines of his skin, the frantic dart of his eyes. The crowd had seen. The world was seeing. The spotlight stayed on me, as the board remained beside me, an unbroken wall of legitimacy and trust. The celebration had shifted. The music had stopped, but no one cared. The party had become something else entirely, a night that would be remembered for years, a night where the story changed. I stepped back from the microphone, letting the applause roll on, letting the cameras catch every angle. The light followed me relentless, refusing to let me fade into the shadows again. And in that moment, standing tall beneath the blaze of the chandeliers, I knew this was not the end of my fight. It was only the beginning, and Daniel Miller had just learned the cost of underestimating me. The morning after the Christmas party, Boston woke up buzzing with my name. Every news outlet splashed the same headlines across their front pages. Morrison Industries names. Claire Thompson as new CEO. Former executive Daniel Miller, under fire for alleged corporate betrayal. My face stared back at me from television screens, in coffee shops, newspapers stacked at corner stands, and glowing tablets on the subway. For the first time, I was not invisible. But alongside the announcement came the storm. Leaked documents, whispers of betrayal, and screenshots of Daniel's emails made their way into the press. The proof I had gathered had found its place in the light. Words like collusion and breach of trust filled the air, heavy and undeniable. Morrison's legal team worked overnight, preparing for the battle they knew was coming. That afternoon, I sat across from Harold Bennett Morrison's longtime counsel. He was a seasoned man with silver hair and eyes that had seen decades of boardroom wars. He spread the stack of files across the polished table and tapped the top page with one finger. "Claire, these emails are damning. He cannot escape this." I leaned forward, the weight of weeks of secrecy finally lifting. "Do you think he knows how deep he's buried?" Harold gave a humorless smile. "Men like him never believe the hole is real until the dirt starts filling in." I nodded, watching the sunlight reflect off the glass windows of the office. Daniel's name was already trending, but not for the reasons he wanted. He was a joke in the business community, a whispered warning in every corporate corridor. Still, humiliation was not enough for him. He wanted to fight. 2 days later, the summons came. Daniel had filed a lawsuit against me and Morrison Industries, claiming conflict of interest and abuse of authority. His lawyers argued that my appointment as CEO had been orchestrated to silence him and cover up my so-called failures. The arrogance was so thick on the pages that it almost choked me. When I told Harold, he didn't even blink. "Let him try. The law is not on his side, Claire. We will make that clear." The courthouse was smaller than the headlines made it feel. The day of the hearing, reporters crowded the steps, microphones reaching like grasping hands as cameras flashed with blinding persistence. I walked past them with Harold at my side, the winter wind cutting through my coat, but never touching the fire in my chest. Inside the room was cold and austere. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, jaw-tight suit pressed to perfection, Ashley at his side. She tried to look confident, but the way her eyes darted betrayed the truth. They were cornered animals snarling at shadows. When the judge entered the room, hushed. She was a stern woman with sharp glasses perched on her nose. She listened as Daniel's lawyer launched into his tirade about corporate betrayal, favoritism, and a conspiracy to dethrone a rightful executive. His words spilled like poison, but even as they did, I saw the judge's expression harden with impatience. Then it was Harold's turn. He rose slowly, methodically, holding the stack of evidence like a sword. "Your Honor, this case is nothing more than a desperate attempt to distract from the real issue. The plaintiff was caught colluding with a direct competitor, leaking confidential contracts, and compromising the integrity of this company. The board acted in full accordance with its duty, and the appointment of Ms. Thompson was based entirely on merit and documented results." The judge leafed through the evidence, her pen tapping once against the bench. The sound echoed like a gavel. She looked at Daniel, then back to Harold. "Mr. Miller, these claims are without merit. This lawsuit is dismissed." The words struck like lightning. I watched the color drain from Daniel's face, his lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. Ashley shifted uncomfortably, her hand tightening on his arm. The courtroom rustled with movement, reporters scribbling furiously, recording every syllable. When the judge left the room, broke into noise. Cameras clicked, Questions were shouted, and Daniel stormed past me, his shoulder grazing mine. His eyes were fire, but I only met them with ice. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a stage. Reporters swarmed asking if I felt vindicated, if Morrison's future was secure, if Daniel would face further consequences. I gave no grand speech. I simply said, "Justice has spoken. Morrison's future is stronger than ever." By evening, the headlines were relentless. Daniel Miller loses lawsuit. Judge calls case baseless. Former executive's reputation in ruins. Television anchors replayed the moment again and again, his face caught in high definition as the verdict landed. His downfall was no longer a whisper. It was a spectacle. That night, alone in my office, I watched the news cycle on repeat. The glow of the screen painted the room in cold light. Every station, every outlet carried the same truth. He was finished. His credibility shattered, his name a punchline. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, the city lights stretching across Boston like veins of fire. For years I had been their shadow, the one dismissed, ignored, humiliated. Now the world had seen him fall, and it was only the first ripple in a much larger tide. The sound of the city hummed through the glass, alive and relentless. I let it fill me, steady and quiet. Tomorrow, there would be more battles. But tonight the law had spoken, and it had spoken in my favor. The knock on my office door came late the next evening, soft at first, then insistent. When I opened it, I found my parents standing there with Michael a step behind them. Margaret's eyes were swollen, her makeup smudged, as if she had been crying for hours. Robert looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his usual authority gone. Michael shifted nervously, his gaze darting from me to the floor as if searching for escape. Margaret stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Claire, we need to talk." Her voice cracked, fragile, almost foreign to me. I let the silence hang, the weight of years pressing between us. She tried again. "We were wrong. About everything." Robert's lips pressed together in a hard line. He said nothing, but his silence was its own admission. Michael cleared his throat, his words stumbling out. "I never meant for it to go so far. You know how Dad and Mom can be. I went along with it." I folded my arms, feeling the steady beat of my own heart. "You came here for forgiveness." Margaret nodded quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, we've lost so much already. The church, our friends, they look at us differently now. They whisper when we walk in. They ask about you, about Daniel, about how we could treat our own daughter this way." Her voice broke into a sob. "Please, Claire." Images flashed in my mind, sharp and unforgiving. Family dinners where Michael was celebrated for the smallest achievements, while my work was ignored. My wedding day, when Margaret whispered that Michael was the real pride of the family. Years of laughter at my expense, years of silence from Robert, when I needed a father's voice. I looked at them, each word tasting like ice. "I don't need your apology. Not now. Not when the world already knows who you are." Michael stepped forward, desperation bleeding through his voice. "Claire, please. You're all we have left. People talk about us at the business association. At church, they avoid us. Dad's name doesn't carry weight anymore. You can fix this." I let out a breath, steady and cold. "I am not here to fix the image you destroyed yourselves. I am not your shield." Margaret sobbed harder, clutching Robert's arm as if she might collapse. He finally spoke, his voice gravelly and low. "We made mistakes. We thought we were protecting Michael, guiding the family the right way. We failed you." The words hung heavy, but they carried no warmth, no comfort. They were too late, arriving only after their world had begun to collapse. I thought of the church members whispering behind pews, the businessmen in Boston who now scoffed when Robert entered a room. Their social currency had been drained not by me, but by the truth they could no longer hide. I straightened my shoulders. "I don't hate you. I don't even want revenge against you. The world is already doing that. Let them whisper. Let them laugh. That is the sentence you earned." For a long moment no one spoke. The sound of Margaret's weeping filled the office sharp against the silence. Michael's hands clenched into fists, then opened helplessly. Robert stared at me with eyes that looked older than his years, as if the weight of reputation stripped from him had hollowed him out. Finally, Margaret whispered, "We just wanted our daughter back." I turned away, the city lights burning bright beyond the window. "I'm not the daughter you knew anymore." They left quietly, their footsteps retreating down the hallway, the sound fading into nothing. When the door clicked shut, I felt no triumph, no victory, only clarity. In the weeks that followed, the stories spread faster than any apology could contain. The congregation at the church whispered openly about Margaret and Robert, shaking their heads at their hypocrisy. Longtime friends crossed the street to avoid them. Invitations to dinners and charity events stopped arriving. The business association where Robert once stood as a respected voice now saw him as a cautionary tale. Michael found himself excluded from networking events he had once dominated his phone, silent, his name no longer opening doors. I didn't need to lift a finger. The community wrote its own verdict, sharp and merciless. One Sunday morning, as I walked past the church with Emily by my side, I saw them standing alone on the steps. Margaret clutched her coat tight. Robert stared down at the pavement. Michael shifted awkwardly. No one greeted them. No one extended a hand. They were ghosts in a place they once commanded. Emily glanced at me, her voice low. "Does it hurt seeing them like that?" I shook my head slowly. "No, it doesn't hurt. It just feels finished." We walked on the sound of bells echoing behind us. The past had lost its grip, the weight of their betrayal no longer dragging me under. I didn't need to strike them down. Society had already done it for me. That night, as I sat alone in my office, the memory of their faces lingered, not as wounds, but as reminders. They had chosen their path, and now they walked it alone. I had no desire to follow. I closed the blinds and let the city fade into darkness. The world had turned its back on them, and for once I no longer cared. The boardroom gleamed with glass and polished wood, the Morrison logo etched into the wall behind me as I stood at the head of the long table. The air felt different now, lighter, charged with a sense of anticipation that no one could ignore. I looked around at the faces of the men and women who had carried the company through storm after storm, and for the first time, I saw something in their eyes I had never seen directed at me before. Trust. I rested my hands on the table. Before we begin today's agenda, I want to acknowledge someone in this room who changed the course of this company. My gaze shifted to Emily, sitting 2 seats down, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She blinked, startled, her eyes darting to mine as if unsure she had heard me correctly. "Emily Davis has shown remarkable courage." When Daniel Miller abused his position when he tried to silence dissent, she spoke up. She told the truth even when it could have cost her everything. Murmurs rippled through the room, heads turning toward her. Emily's face flushed, her lips parting as she shook her head slightly. I just did what was right," she whispered. I smiled, steady and clear. Doing what is right is never just anything. It is everything. The room fell quiet. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the city outside. Then slowly the sound of applause began, soft at first, then swelling until it filled every corner of the room. Board members clapped, department heads joined in, and soon even the assistants and analysts standing along the walls were on their feet. Emily pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders trembling. She lowered them with tears streaking down her cheeks, her voice catching. "I almost left Morrison," she admitted, her words breaking through the applause. "After what Daniel put me through, the pressure, the humiliation, I thought I couldn't do it anymore." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself on. "But then I saw you. You didn't give up. You fought back. And somehow I thought, maybe I could stay. Maybe I could believe in this place again." The clapping surged once more, louder, sharper, not just for her, but for what her words meant. She wasn't the only one who had considered leaving under Daniel's reign. She wasn't the only one who had doubted whether Morrison was still a place worth fighting for. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, but it was no longer a burden. It was a mantle one I was finally ready to carry. Emily, you didn't just choose to stay, you chose to believe. And for that, I am grateful beyond words. This company is stronger because of you. William, seated at the far end of the table, gave a single nod, his expression solemn. He understood what this moment meant, not only for Emily, but for every employee who had been waiting for proof that Morrison could be more than one man's corruption. As the applause tapered off, Emily wiped her tears, her smile unsteady but radiant. She looked at me with something I recognized instantly: hope. The meeting shifted back to budgets, projections, and contracts, but the energy in the room had changed. It wasn't just business anymore. It was a belief threaded through every word spoken, every plan laid. Afterward, as the board members filed out, Emily lingered by the doorway. I walked over my heels, clicking against the marble floor. She looked up at me, her eyes red, but her smile unshaken. "Thank you," she said softly. I shook my head. "No, Emily. Thank you." She nodded once, as if committing the words to memory, before leaving the room. I watched her go, the echo of her footsteps, a quiet promise that the future of Morrison was no longer built on fear, but on courage. When the room finally emptied, I stood alone by the windows, the city lights flickering like embers against the winter sky. For so long I had fought alone, carrying the weight of betrayal, humiliation, and silence. Now I was no longer just standing for myself. I was standing for them, for every voice that had been stifled, for every hand that had once trembled in fear, but now rose in applause. The boardroom that once felt like a battlefield had become a sanctuary, and as I stood there steady and unbroken, I knew this was only the beginning of what I was meant to build. The city stretched out beneath me, Boston glowing under its blanket of Christmas lights, every street a strand of gold and red weaving through the dark. From the penthouse office of Morrison, the glass walls framed it all like a promise kept. The room was quiet, only the faint hum of the heating system and the soft clink as I set my glass down on the desk. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, not empty, but full, holding the weight of everything that had already been decided. I walked slowly toward the window, the reflection of my own figure superimposed against the skyline. The glass shimmered with the glow of the city, but my focus was drawn to the corridor beyond the office door. Daniel stood there, shoulders bent forward, his expression hollow. His once proud posture had collapsed into something I almost did not recognize. His suit, pressed to perfection earlier in the evening, now hung tired on his frame. For a brief second, I wondered if he realized that this hallway would be the closest he would ever come again to the seat of power he had taken for granted. He did not speak, not even when his eyes locked on mine through the glass. There was no apology, no fire, no venom left. Only bitterness, clinging to the edges of a man who had built his life on arrogance and now had nothing left to hold. I lifted the glass of wine to my lips, the deep red catching the reflection of the Christmas lights strung across the office. It was not a toast to him, nor to victory, but to something larger, something finally mine. I thought of my parents, of Margaret's words on my wedding day, of Robert's silence that had always cut deeper than any insult. I thought of Michael, their chosen one, who now struggled to hold his reputation intact after standing with Daniel. For years I had begged for their recognition, but as I stood at the height of Boston, I realized how little it mattered. Their voices, once so loud in my head, were now echoes fading into irrelevance. Behind me, the office carried the weight of new beginnings. Files stacked neatly, the nameplate already replaced, the shadow of his presence erased. On the shelf rested the hard drive I had tucked away, the one that carried every detail of his betrayal. I no longer needed to look at it. The law had spoken, the board had spoken, and the world had spoken. Daniel was finished. I moved back to the desk and sat in the leather chair, its frame cool against my hands. From here, the entire city seemed within reach, not as a possession, but as a reminder. The battles I had fought were not for power alone, but for the right to be seen as more than the failure they had branded me. My success was not their gift to me, nor was it an accident. It was mine, carved from the ridicule, the humiliation, and the endless nights of being underestimated. Daniel shifted in the hallway, but he did not knock. He knew better. The guards would escort him out soon, and he would walk away from this building not as a man of influence, but as a reminder of what happens when pride turns to rot. I had not raised my voice to him, had not shouted or cursed. I did not need to. Silence, power, and truth had done the work for me. As the night deepened, I leaned back the skyline, glittering like 1,000 witnesses. My reflection caught my eye once more, and I did not see the girl who had once trembled under her family's judgment or her husband's cruelty. I saw a woman who had stepped into the fire and walked out with everything they swore she could never have. I let the wine roll slowly in the glass and whispered into the quiet. I do not take revenge with cruel words. I let truth and time write the verdict. The weight of those words hung in the room, not as a declaration of bitterness, but as a release. The war was over, and I had won by living. The Christmas lights across the city flickered brighter, reflected against the glass of the penthouse windows. I lifted the glass once more, the taste of red wine grounding me in the present, the lights of Boston wrapping the room in a warmth I had never known before. Behind the door, footsteps faded. Daniel was gone. His shadow no longer touched me. I closed my eyes briefly, not to shut out the world, but to feel it fully. The hum of the city, the pulse of the building, the strength that had carried me here. It was all I needed. And as I opened them again, I smiled not out of triumph, but out of peace. If this story has touched you, stay with me and hear the other journeys of justice and dignity that lie ahead.